March 22, 1944. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Commander Toshihiko Imai sat in the dimly lit intelligence analysis room, surrounded by stacks of recently translated American documents. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted a reconnaissance photograph, one of dozens that had arrived from Truk just days before the American carrier task force had devastated the base. The image showed an aircraft carrier unlike any Japanese intelligence had seen before. Her massive flight deck stretched across the photograph, and what captured Imai's complete attention was what lined both sides of that deck: rows of anti-aircraft guns, dozens of them, perhaps 60 or more visible in this single photograph. This cannot be their standard design. No navy would build carriers with this much defensive firepower unless they knew something we do not. The photograph bore identification markings in English: CV-9, USS Essex. The Americans had given this ship the same name as their carrier class, suggesting she was the lead vessel of an entirely new generation. Intelligence reports from reconnaissance flights and submarine observations had confirmed at least 6 more of these carriers were already operational in the Pacific. 6 identical ships, each capable of carrying 90 aircraft, each bristling with anti-aircraft weapons that made Japanese carriers look defenseless by comparison. Commander Imai had been analyzing American naval capabilities since 1939. He had studied pre-war U.S. Navy construction programs, tracked their industrial output, calculated their theoretical production capacity. But nothing had prepared him for the mathematical reality contained in these documents and photographs. The numbers suggested something that seemed impossible, something that would force the Imperial Japanese Navy to confront an enemy whose industrial power exceeded every assumption, every calculation, every optimistic intelligence estimate made before the war. The journey to this revelation had begun 3 weeks earlier, when American forces recaptured Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Japanese forces retreating from the atoll had abandoned their headquarters in such haste that they left behind filing cabinets filled with intelligence documents. Among those documents were captured American technical manuals, photographs taken by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, and most importantly, translated excerpts from American naval publications that Japanese intelligence officers had been collecting since early 1943. The documents had arrived in Tokyo via submarine on March 15th. The Allied translator and interpreter section had already processed the most urgent operational intelligence. What remained were technical documents, equipment manuals, and reconnaissance photographs that required detailed analysis. These materials had been assigned to Imai's section, the American Intelligence Department within the Imperial Japanese Navy's Intelligence Bureau. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Imai spread the documents across his desk in chronological order. The earliest dated to November 1942, reconnaissance photographs taken by a Japanese patrol aircraft of Pearl Harbor from extreme altitude. The photographs showed what appeared to be a new class of carrier under construction at the naval shipyard. The vessel's distinctive profile, its massive island superstructure, and its unusual length suggested this was not simply an enlarged Yorktown-class carrier. It was something fundamentally different. Subsequent photographs from early 1943 showed multiple vessels of this new class at various stages of completion across American shipyards. Imai counted at least 8 distinct hulls visible in the reconnaissance images, 8 carriers under and construction simultaneously. The implications were staggering. Japanese carrier construction had struggled to replace losses from Coral Sea and Midway. The combined fleet had entered the war with 10 carriers. By August 1942, only 4 remained operational. New construction could not keep pace with combat losses. The Taiho, Japan's most advanced carrier design, would not be ready for service until mid-1944. She would be one ship, joining perhaps 3 or 4 other carriers still operational. The Americans had 8 of these new Essex-class carriers under construction in late 1942 alone. Intelligence reports suggested they had ordered 19 more after the December 7th Pearl Harbor attack, 19 additional carriers beyond the initial construction program. The numbers defied comprehension. Imai picked up a technical document that had been translated from an American naval manual. The document described maintenance procedures for aircraft elevators on Essex-class carriers. The specifications were revealing. 3 aircraft elevators per ship, 2 centerline elevators, and 1 deck-edge elevator mounted on the port side. The deck-edge elevator was particularly notable because it allowed the carrier to conduct simultaneous launch and recovery operations. While aircraft landed on the aft portion of the flight deck, the deck-edge elevator could move recovered aircraft to the hangar deck without interfering with landing operations. This meant the carrier could maintain continuous flight operations at a tempo Japanese carriers could not match. Japanese carrier doctrine required clearing the flight deck before spotting aircraft for launch. The process was sequential. Land recovered aircraft. Strike them below to the hangar deck using centerline elevators. Spot the next strike package on the flight deck. Launch the strike. Only then could recovery operations resume. The entire cycle required coordination and timing that limited the frequency of strike operations. The American design philosophy appeared fundamentally different. The deck-edge elevator allowed continuous cycle operations. Aircraft could be recovered while the next strike was being spotted. The tempo of operations would be limited only by crew endurance and aircraft maintenance requirements, not by the sequential nature of elevator operations. Imai calculated the implications. A Japanese carrier could launch perhaps 2 major strikes per day under optimal conditions. Morning strike, recovery, respot. Afternoon strike, recovery. The mechanical limitations of elevator operations and flight deck spotting imposed this rhythm. An Essex-class carrier with its deck-edge elevator could theoretically launch 3 or perhaps even 4 strikes per day. The same number of aircraft generating 50% more offensive capability through superior operational design. Multiply that advantage across 6 or 8 carriers operating in a task force, and the mathematical disparity became overwhelming. But the elevator design was only one aspect of a comprehensive engineering philosophy that Japanese designers had not anticipated. Imai examined another technical document, this one describing the hangar deck arrangements. Essex-class carriers had open hangar decks, unlike Japanese carriers whose enclosed hangars were designed to maximize aircraft storage. The American open design sacrificed some storage capacity, but provided critical advantages in damage control. Fires could vent directly overboard, rather than being contained within enclosed spaces. Explosion overpressure could dissipate without fracturing structural bulkheads. The entire ship was designed around the assumption that carriers would be hit, would be damaged, and needed to survive long enough to return to port for repair. Japanese carrier design philosophy had evolved differently. Japanese carriers emphasized aircraft capacity and striking power. The Shokaku-class carriers could operate 72 aircraft from enclosed hangars that maximized storage efficiency. Protection against damage came from speed, maneuverability, and the assumption that air superiority would prevent enemy strikes from reaching the carriers in the first place. This assumption had proven tragically flawed at Midway when American dive bombers penetrated the fighter screen and struck all 4 Japanese carriers within minutes. The enclosed hangar decks had trapped explosions and fire. Fuel lines had ruptured. Aviation gasoline had ignited. Secondary explosions from stored ordnance had gutted the ships. All 4 carriers sank within hours. The Americans had studied Midway's lessons and apparently drawn different conclusions. Rather than relying on not being hit, they had designed ships that could absorb damage and continue fighting. The Essex-class specifications included armor protection that Japanese reconnaissance reports had initially dismissed as excessive. Special treatment. Steel armor protected vital spaces. The hangar deck itself served as the armored deck rather than the flight deck, providing structural protection for spaces below, while allowing the flight deck to be a lightweight wooden structure that could be rapidly repaired when damaged. Underwater protection extended 17 feet below the waterline, designed to localize torpedo damage and prevent flooding from spreading throughout the ship. Imai picked up a reconnaissance photograph taken in February 1944 during the American strike on Truk. The image showed 3 Essex-class carriers operating together, their flight decks crowded with aircraft spotted for launch. Each carrier's deck showed rows of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers arranged in precise formations. Imai counted the visible aircraft. 36 aircraft spotted on each carrier's deck. Another reconnaissance photograph taken minutes later showed the carriers launching this deckload strike, all 3. Carriers conducting simultaneous launch operations, their aircraft forming up into a massive strike package that exceeded 100 aircraft. 100 aircraft from 3 carriers. Japanese carrier divisions typically operated 2 carriers together. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, operating as Carrier Division 5, could launch approximately 140 aircraft in a coordinated strike under optimal conditions. But such strikes required extensive preparation, precise timing, and favorable weather. The American carriers appeared to conduct such operations routinely. Reconnaissance reports described American task forces launching multiple deckload strikes daily, maintaining air patrols continuously, and conducting combat search and rescue operations simultaneously. The operational tempo suggested a level of organizational efficiency and logistical support that Japanese forces could not match. The captured American documents included maintenance schedules and supply manifests that provided insight into how this tempo was sustained. Essex-class carriers carried 240,000 gallons of aviation fuel, enough to support extended operations far from base. Ammunition magazines stored sufficient ordnance for days of continuous combat operations. Each carrier's complement included over 3,000 personnel when the air group was embarked. Approximately 750 of these crew members operated the carrier's anti-aircraft battery, a number that exceeded the entire crew of many Japanese destroyers. The Americans had built carriers that were self-contained floating cities capable of sustained independent operations for weeks without resupply. Japanese carriers required more frequent logistics support. Fuel capacity was smaller, ordnance storage was limited. The doctrine assumed that carriers would operate relatively close to established bases where supplies could be replenished between operations. This doctrine had worked well during the war's opening months when Japanese forces controlled numerous bases across the Pacific. By mid-1944, those bases had been recaptured or bypassed. American submarines made supply runs increasingly dangerous. Japanese carriers that survived combat were increasingly constrained by logistics rather than battle damage. Imai reviewed intelligence summaries describing American fleet train operations. The Americans had created an entire logistics organization dedicated to supporting carrier task forces at sea. Oilers, ammunition ships, stores ships, repair vessels, hospital ships, even floating dry docks, all organized into service squadrons that followed the combat task forces. These support vessels allowed American carriers to remain at sea indefinitely. When a carrier depleted its fuel or ordnance, support ships came alongside for replenishment at sea. The carrier never needed to return to port. The strike operations never needed to pause. The relentless operational tempo could be sustained indefinitely. Japanese logistics remained anchored to established bases. When carriers expended their ordnance, they returned to port for resupply. This required days or even weeks of transit time, during which the carriers were unavailable for operations. The Americans had eliminated this vulnerability through organizational innovation, as significant as any technological advancement. They had created a logistics system that treated carriers as permanently deployed offensive weapons rather than ships that periodically ventured from port to conduct operations. The financial implications were equally staggering. Imai examined a translated American congressional document discussing naval appropriations. The document revealed that the United States Congress had authorized construction of 32 Essex-class carriers, 32 ships of a single class. The total cost exceeded $6 billion, more than the entire Japanese national budget for 1943. 6 ships had already entered service. 8 more would be operational by the end of 1944, according to American construction schedules. The remainder would follow through 1945 and 46, assuming the war lasted that long. Japan had built 10 fleet carriers between 1919 and 1941. The Americans would build 32 carriers of superior design in just 5 years. The industrial disparity was so vast that Imai struggled to comprehend how Japanese planners could have believed victory was achievable. But the most disturbing document was a photographic intelligence report from a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft that had observed an Essex-class carrier during flight operations. The report included timing data. The carrier had launched a full deckload strike of 72 aircraft in 26 minutes. 26 minutes from first aircraft airborne to last aircraft launched. The pilot had noted that immediately after launch operations concluded, aircraft began landing from a previous strike. The carrier commenced recovery operations before the launched strike had even formed up. The operational cycle was continuous. Launch, recover, respot, launch again. The tempo never stopped. Imai calculated the implications for carrier warfare. If American carriers could maintain this operational tempo, if they could generate 3 or 4 strikes per day compared to Japan's 2 strikes, if they could conduct simultaneous combat air patrol and strike operations while Japanese carriers had to choose between offensive and defensive employment, then the mathematical outcome of any carrier engagement was predetermined. American carriers would simply overwhelm Japanese forces through sustained high-tempo operations that Japanese carriers could not match. Victory would not depend on pilot skill or tactical brilliance. It would be determined by industrial organization and operational design philosophy, implemented years before the first shots were fired. The comparison with Japanese carrier capabilities was stark and devastating. The Shokaku-class carriers, Japan's most capable fleet carriers, displaced 29,000 tons and could operate 72 aircraft under optimal conditions. They had no deck-edge elevators. Their enclosed hangar decks maximized storage but created fire hazards. Their anti-aircraft armament included only 12 5-inch guns and approximately 40 smaller caliber weapons, adequate defense against limited attacks, but insufficient against sustained raids. Most critically, they lacked the logistical support structure that allowed extended operations far from base. When the Shokaku had been damaged at Coral Sea in May 1942, she had required months of yard time for repair. When the Zuikaku had lost most of her air group at Coral Sea, she could not reconstitute her strike capability in time for Midway, because Japanese doctrine did not allow cross-decking aircraft between carriers the way American forces did routinely. The Americans had built a system where individual carriers were interchangeable components of a larger striking force. Air groups could be transferred between carriers. Damaged ships could be withdrawn for repair, while replacement carriers joined the task force without degrading overall capability. The organizational flexibility allowed the Americans to sustain operations even when individual ships were damaged or undergoing maintenance. Japanese forces lacked this flexibility. Each carrier was unique. Air groups were permanently assigned to specific ships. When a carrier was damaged, both the ship and its air group were removed from operations until both could return to full combat readiness. Commander Imai had been tasked with producing an intelligence estimate of American carrier strength for the remainder of 1944. The estimate would inform combined fleet planning for the decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine assumed would determine the war's outcome. Imai understood that his analysis would be controversial. Japanese planning had assumed rough parity in carrier strength by mid-1944 as Japanese shipyards completed new construction. The documents before him suggested a completely different reality. By the end of 1944, American forces would field approximately 15 Essex-class carriers plus 9 Independence-class light carriers, 24 fleet and light carriers compared to perhaps 6 Japanese carriers that might still be operational. The numerical disparity was 4-1. When accounting for the superior operational tempo of American carriers, the effective disparity approached 6-1 or even 8-1. No tactical genius, no crew training program, no weapon system could overcome such overwhelming material disadvantage. Imai wrote his estimate carefully, choosing words that would communicate the severity of the situation without appearing defeatist. Japanese military culture did not tolerate pessimism, even when pessimism was simply accurate assessment of facts. He documented the specifications of Essex-class carriers. He included calculations showing the superior operational tempo enabled by deck-edge elevators and open hangar decks. He provided production schedules showing that American carrier strength would continue growing throughout 1945. He concluded with an assessment that any fleet engagement against American carrier task forces would result in Japanese defeat unless Japanese forces achieved surprise, achieved overwhelming local superiority, or accepted prohibitive casualties in exchange for potentially destroying 1 or 2 American carriers. The estimate was classified top secret and distributed to senior officers in Naval General Staff and Combined Fleet Headquarters. The response was immediate and dismissive. Several staff officers questioned whether the intelligence was accurate. Some suggested the Americans were conducting an elaborate deception operation, building what appeared to be carriers but filling them with dummy aircraft and inflated crew numbers to intimidate Japanese forces. Others acknowledged the intelligence was probably accurate, but insisted that Japanese pilot quality and tactical doctrine would compensate for numerical disadvantages. A few officers noted privately that the estimate confirmed what Admiral Yamamoto had warned before the war, that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against American industrial power. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematical reality that Commander Imai had documented would be tested in June 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher deployed 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, 8 light carriers. These carriers embarked approximately 900 aircraft. The Japanese mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa deployed 9 carriers with approximately 430 aircraft. The numerical disparity was roughly 2-1 in American favor, but the operational disparity would prove far greater than the numbers suggested. Ozawa's battle plan attempted to leverage Japanese advantages. Japanese carrier aircraft had longer range than their American counterparts. Japanese scouts could search to 560 miles. Japanese strike aircraft could attack at 400 miles. American carriers could scout to 350 miles and strike at approximately 200 miles. Ozawa planned to use this range advantage to strike American carriers while remaining outside American striking range. He would launch strikes from long distance, recover his aircraft, and withdraw before American counterstrikes could reach his carriers. The plan assumed Japanese forces could find American carriers first, could penetrate American defenses, and could disengage after striking. Every assumption would prove false. American radar detected Japanese scout aircraft at extreme range. The SK air search radar equipped on Essex-class carriers could track aircraft at distances exceeding 100 miles, providing early warning that allowed fighter directors to vector combat air patrol for interception. Japanese scouts attempting to locate American carriers found themselves intercepted by Hellcat fighters guided to their positions by radar. Many scouts were shot down before reporting American positions. Those that survived and transmitted contact reports found their transmissions intercepted and triangulated by American radio intelligence units, providing American forces with accurate bearings to Japanese carriers even before American scouts made visual contact. When Ozawa launched his first strike at 8:30 in the morning on June 19th, 72 aircraft departed his carriers bound for the American task force. American radar detected the formation while it was still forming up over the Japanese carriers, approximately 150 miles from the American force. Fighter directors had 30 minutes advance warning. Hellcat fighters were vectored to intercept positions calculated to achieve maximum defensive effectiveness. The Hellcats struck the Japanese formation before it reached attack range. Coordinated attacks from multiple directions broke up the Japanese strike. Formations were scattered. Coordination was lost. Of the 72 aircraft in the first wave, only 27 survived to return to their carriers. Not one scored a hit on American ships. Ozawa launched 3 more strikes that day. The second wave at 9:56 hours with 129 aircraft. American radar detected the formation at 9:15 hours. 97 Japanese aircraft were shot down. 6 damaged American ships, none critically. The third wave at 10:00 hours with 47 aircraft, 27 were shot down. The fourth wave at 1:30 hours with 82 aircraft. 73 were shot down. By day's end, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft in combat. American combat losses totaled 29 aircraft on June 19th. The exchange rate was 12-1 in American favor. The disparity was not explained by pilot quality alone, though American pilots certainly benefited from superior training and more combat experience by mid-1944. The fundamental difference was systematic technological superiority integrated into operational doctrine. American radar provided early warning. American fighter directors coordinated interceptions. American proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells created defensive barriers that Japanese formations could not penetrate. Most importantly, American carriers could maintain this defense continuously because their operational tempo allowed sustained combat air patrol operations that Japanese carriers could not match. Essex-class carriers launched and recovered fighters throughout the day, maintaining layered defenses that never weakened regardless of how many strikes Japanese forces sent. From Ozawa's perspective aboard the carrier Taiho, the battle was incomprehensible disaster. Strike after strike departed to attack American carriers. None achieved significant hits. Few aircraft returned. Radio communications from strike leaders indicated they were being intercepted by fighters who appeared to know exactly where Japanese formations would be. The only explanation was that American detection capabilities exceeded anything Japanese intelligence had believed possible. Ozawa had no way of knowing that American radar technology had advanced so far beyond Japanese capabilities. He had no framework for understanding that the Americans were fighting with perfect information while Japanese forces operated blind. The technological gap extended beyond radar into weapons systems themselves. The proximity fuse, developed by American scientists at the Applied Physics Laboratory and manufactured at rates exceeding 100,000 units per month by 1944, had entered combat use in January 1943. The fuse used miniature radar transmitters to detonate anti-aircraft shells when they passed near aircraft, dramatically increasing the lethality of defensive fire. Japanese pilots reported shells bursting near their aircraft with uncanny accuracy, even when gunners appeared to be aiming imperfectly. The psychological impact was significant. Pilots could not develop countermeasures because they did not understand what they were facing. Japanese engineers had considered proximity fuse technology. Multiple research groups had studied the concept. But building proximity fuses required industrial capacity, precision manufacturing, and systematic quality control, at scales Japanese industry could not match while simultaneously producing ships, aircraft, and conventional weapons. The proximity fuse was not simply one invention, but the product of an entire industrial ecosystem optimized for high-technology mass production. American industry could produce over 1 million proximity fuses monthly by late 1944. Japanese industry struggled to produce adequate supplies of conventional ammunition. The battle continued on June 20th, when American forces located the retreating Japanese fleet and launched strikes that sank the carrier Hio and damaged 2 others. But the decisive outcome had been determined on the 19th when Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed as an offensive force. The Americans had demonstrated that superior technology and operational tempo could create advantages so decisive that traditional factors like courage, training, and tactical skill became secondary considerations. Japanese forces had fought bravely. Pilots had pressed attacks despite overwhelming opposition. None of it mattered when facing an enemy whose technological advantages made conventional combat futile. Commander Imai's intelligence estimate had predicted exactly this outcome. His analysis had shown that American carriers could generate sortie rates Japanese carriers could not match. The battle confirmed his calculations with brutal precision. American carriers had maintained continuous combat air patrol throughout both days of battle. They had launched multiple strikes against Japanese positions. They had conducted combat search and rescue operations to recover downed pilots, all simultaneously. The operational tempo that Imai had warned about was not theoretical, it was devastatingly real. In the months following the Philippine Sea, Japanese naval aviation never recovered. Pilot losses exceeded replacement capacity. Fuel shortages limited training. By October 1944, during the battle at Leyte Gulf, Japanese carriers had been reduced to decoys with barely trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft. The Zuikaku, last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force, sailed into battle at Leyte with an air group so depleted and poorly trained that American forces described the engagement as slaughter rather than combat. The carrier was sunk along with 3 light carriers. Japan's carrier force had been annihilated. The Essex-class carriers continued operations through August 1945, striking targets across Japan itself. By war's end, 14 Essex-class carriers had seen combat in World War II. None had been sunk. 2. Franklin and Bunker Hill had sustained catastrophic damage from kamikaze attacks and survived to return to port under their own power. The damage that destroyed Japanese carriers at Midway merely disabled Essex-class carriers long enough for damage control teams to contain fires and conduct emergency repairs. The design philosophy that prioritized survivability over maximum aircraft capacity had been vindicated by combat results. The production statistics told the final story of industrial competition between two nations with vastly different capabilities. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards produced 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. They also produced 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls. They produced 71 escort carriers built on merchant ship hulls for submarine warfare and convoy protection. Total American carrier production exceeded 100 ships of all types. Japan built 17 carriers of all types during the same period, most converted from other hulls rather than purpose-built. The numerical disparity was 6-1. When accounting for the superior capabilities of Essex-class carriers compared to Japanese equivalents, the effective disparity approached 10-1 or more, but production numbers alone did not capture the true scale of American advantage. The logistics train that supported carrier operations represented organizational achievement as significant as the carriers themselves. By 1945, the U.S. Navy operated service squadrons with hundreds of support vessels. These ships allowed carriers to remain at sea for months, conducting sustained operations without returning to base. Japanese carriers that survived battle damage increasingly found themselves confined to port by fuel shortages and lack of spare parts. American carriers operated continuously, their tempo limited only by crew endurance rather than logistics. The personnel trained to operate these systems represented another dimension of American advantage that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. Each Essex-class carrier required over 3,000 personnel when fully manned with air group embarked. Training these crews required infrastructure that extended across the continental United States. Pilot training. Schools graduated thousands of aviators annually. Maintenance schools trained mechanics and technicians. Gunnery schools trained the hundreds of personnel required to operate carrier anti-aircraft batteries. The training pipeline produced replacement personnel faster than combat could deplete them. By late 1944, American carrier air groups included pilots with hundreds of hours of flight training before their first combat mission. Japanese replacement pilots by that time might have 50 hours of training, barely enough to take off and land safely. The contrast illustrated fundamental differences in how the two nations approached warfare. Japan had invested in a small number of highly trained elite forces, assuming that quality would compensate for limited quantity. This assumption worked well in the war's opening months, when Japanese pilots with years of training faced American forces still mobilizing. But as the war continued, Japanese forces could not replace losses. Elite units were ground down through attrition. Replacement personnel lacked the training time to match the veterans they replaced. The entire system degraded as losses accumulated. American forces had built training systems designed to produce competent personnel at scale. Individual American pilots might not match the skill of pre-war Japanese veterans, but they received adequate training to perform their missions effectively. More importantly, they were produced in sufficient numbers that losses could be replaced continuously. The system could sustain operations indefinitely because it was designed for industrial-scale warfare rather than relying on individual excellence. The intelligence documents that Commander Imai had analyzed in March 1944 told this story with devastating clarity. The specifications of Essex-class carriers revealed a design philosophy that assumed America would fight an industrial war where material advantage mattered more than tactical brilliance. The production schedules showed that American industry could build these carriers faster than Japanese forces could sink them. The operational tempo calculations demonstrated that American organizational efficiency would overwhelm Japanese forces, even when Japanese pilots and commanders made tactically perfect decisions. Imai's estimate had been dismissed by many senior officers as too pessimistic. Some had questioned his loyalty for suggesting Japanese forces could not overcome American material advantages through superior fighting spirit. Others had acknowledged his analysis was probably accurate, but insisted that Japan had no choice except to fight regardless of the odds. A few officers, including some who had studied at American universities before the war, privately admitted that Imai had simply documented what they already knew, that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. But institutional culture and political reality made acknowledging this truth publicly impossible. The war would continue until defeat became so undeniable that even the most optimistic military officers could no longer deny reality. By August 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, the Pacific War had become primarily a one-sided demonstration of American industrial and technological superiority. Japanese forces still fought with courage and determination. Individual commanders still made tactically sound decisions. None of it changed the fundamental mathematical reality that Imai had documented 18 months earlier. American forces could produce carriers, aircraft, and trained personnel faster than Japanese forces could destroy them. American carriers could generate operational tempo that Japanese carriers could not match. American technology provided advantages that made conventional combat increasingly futile. The Essex-class carriers represented the physical manifestation of American industrial philosophy applied to naval warfare. They were not individually revolutionary. No single technological innovation made them invincible. What made them decisive was the integration of multiple incremental advantages into a systematic approach to carrier operations. Deck-edge elevators increased operational tempo. Open hangar decks improved survivability. Comprehensive armor protection allowed damaged ships to return to port for repair rather than sinking. Large magazines and fuel capacity enabled extended operations without resupply. Sophisticated radar and fire control systems provided information advantages that proved as decisive as any weapon. Most importantly, Essex-class carriers were built in sufficient numbers that losing individual ships did not significantly degrade American naval power. When the carrier Franklin was nearly destroyed by Japanese bombs in March 1945, she was withdrawn from service, repaired, and eventually returned to fleet. But her absence barely registered in overall American carrier strength because 14 other Essex-class carriers remained operational. Japanese forces had no equivalent capacity. When the Taiho was sunk at the Philippine Sea, Japan lost not just one carrier, but nearly 20% of its remaining carrier strength. The loss could not be replaced. The gap in operational capability could not be filled. The documents that Imai had analyzed told the story of two nations with fundamentally different capacities for modern industrial warfare. Japan had entered the war as a regional power with limited industrial base and even more limited access to natural resources. Japanese strategy had assumed a short war where tactical victories would force American acceptance of Japanese conquests before American industrial power could be fully mobilized. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Americans fought exactly the kind of war their industrial capacity enabled, a prolonged conflict where material advantages accumulated steadily until Japanese forces were simply overwhelmed by weight of numbers and superior technology. The lesson was written in carrier production statistics. Japan built 17 carriers between 1941 and 1945. The United States built over 100. Japan produced 63 destroyers during the same period. The United States produced 377. Japan manufactured 76,000 aircraft during the war. The United States manufactured 324,000 aircraft. In every category of military production, American output exceeded Japanese production by factors of 4 to 1 or greater. These were not gaps that could be closed through tactical innovation or superior fighting spirit. They were structural advantages that determined the war's outcome before the first shots were fired. Commander Imai survived the war. After Japan's surrender, he was extensively interviewed by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. American interrogators described him as one of the most reliable and accurate sources of information developed in Japan. His wartime intelligence estimates were reviewed and found to be remarkably prescient. His March 1944 assessment of American carrier capabilities accurately predicted the operational advantages that American forces would demonstrate at the Philippine Sea and subsequent engagements. His production estimates had been conservative. American carrier strength exceeded even his pessimistic projections. In post-war writings for the United States Naval Institute proceedings, Imai provided detailed Japanese perspective on the technological gap that had developed between American and Japanese naval forces. His assessment was that Japanese naval forces had been defeated not through lack of courage or poor tactics, but through systematic technological and industrial inferiority that made individual battles increasingly unwinnable as the war progressed. He estimated that American carrier technology had been approximately 2 years ahead of Japanese equivalents in late 1941. By mid-1943, this had widened to 3 years. By war's end, it had expanded to at least 5 years. The gap widened because American industrial and research capacity allowed rapid iteration and improvement, while Japanese capacity was overwhelmed simply trying to deploy earlier generation systems. The story of Commander Imai examining captured intelligence about Essex-class carriers is ultimately about the moment when mathematical reality overwhelmed optimistic assumptions. Japanese military planning had been built on the assumption that American forces would not fully mobilize their industrial capacity before Japan secured its defensive perimeter and forced a negotiated peace. The captured documents and reconnaissance photographs showed that American mobilization was far more rapid and far more comprehensive than Japanese planners had believed possible. 6 Essex-class carriers were already operational in early 1944. 8 more would join the fleet by year's end. Production would continue through 1945 and into 1946 if the war lasted that long. The numbers were simply impossible for Japanese industry to match. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built around a fleet in being concept where a small number of highly capable ships, commanded by well-trained officers, could achieve local superiority and defeat larger but less capable enemy forces. This concept had worked well in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. It failed completely against an enemy whose industrial capacity allowed building overwhelming force that could absorb losses and continue operations indefinitely. When Japanese commanders sank an American carrier, another appeared to take its place. When Japanese pilots shot down American aircraft, more arrived the next day. The Americans were fighting a war of attrition, where they possessed effectively unlimited resources while Japanese resources steadily diminished. The Essex-class carriers made this war of attrition possible. They provided the mobile striking power that allowed American forces to project air superiority across vast Pacific distances. They enabled the island-hopping campaign that bypassed Japanese strongpoints and captured bases closer to Japan itself. They launched the strikes that destroyed Japanese shipping, isolated Japanese garrisons, and eventually struck Japan's home islands directly. By August 1945, Essex-class carriers were launching daily strikes against targets across Japan, demonstrating American air superiority so complete that Japanese forces could barely contest American operations. The photographs that had so disturbed Commander Imai in March 1944 showed rows of anti-aircraft guns lining Essex-class carrier flight decks. Those guns represented a design philosophy that assumed carriers would be attacked, would be hit, and needed to survive. The Americans had built ships to win a long war through industrial attrition. Japanese carriers, by contrast, had been built to win a short war through tactical excellence. When the war became a prolonged industrial struggle, the outcome was predetermined. The nation that planned for industrial warfare overwhelmed the nation that planned for tactical brilliance. The final irony was that Japanese intelligence had documented American advantages accurately and early in the war. Commander Imai was not the only intelligence officer who recognized that American industrial capacity would eventually prove decisive. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but could promise nothing after that. His warning proved accurate. After Midway in June 1942, Japanese forces never again achieved strategic initiative. By late 1943, when Essex-class carriers began arriving in the Pacific, the war's outcome was mathematically determined. Everything afterward was simply executing the inevitable conclusion. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.